If I had walked into that room 30 seconds earlier, they would have killed me too. Not because I knew too much. Because I was there. Because in that world, proximity to a mistake is the same as making one. I stood in the hallway with my hand on the doorknob, and I heard a sound that wasn't quite a voice and wasn't quite silence, and some animal part of my brain, some part that lives deeper than thought, told me to wait. So I waited. I counted to 10 in my head, which felt like counting to 1,000, and then I heard the second sound. A chair scraping. Footsteps. The particular quality of movement that happens after something irreversible. I took my hand off the doorknob. I walked backward. Slowly, in heels on marble, which is almost impossible to do silently, but I did it. I made it to the staircase. I made it to the car. I made it home. And the next morning I found out that Vincent Castellano, who I'd known for 6 years, who I'd had dinner with 2 weeks prior, who had a wife and 3 daughters and a laugh that sounded like gravel in a cement mixer, was dead. They found him in that room. The room I almost walked into. They never found who did it. But I knew. I knew because of the silence before the chair scraped. I knew because of who wasn't at the funeral. I knew because 3 days later, my husband Michael came home and looked at me in a way he'd never looked at me before. And he said, "You weren't at the club that night, were you?" And I said no. And he said, "Good." And that was the only time we ever spoke about it. That was 1976. I'm telling this now because everyone involved is dead. Because I'm old enough that fear feels different than it used to. Because I spent 40 years carrying something that was too heavy to carry alone. My name is Catherine. I was married to a man who ran numbers in Brooklyn and then ran much more than numbers. I was 22 when I met him. I'm 70 now. And this is what it was really like. Not the movies. Not the myth. The actual weight of it. The silence. The waiting. The slow understanding that you've built your life inside a machine that doesn't stop. And the price of proximity is everything you thought you were. It started the way these things always start. With something that didn't seem like a beginning at all. An introduction at a wedding. My cousin Angie was marrying Tommy Rossini, and the reception was at a place in Bensonhurst, one of those halls with chandeliers that looked expensive but weren't, with round tables covered in white cloth and centerpieces made of roses dyed colors roses don't come in naturally. I was there with my sister, both of us in dresses our mother had saved for months to buy, and we were standing near the bar when Michael came over. He wasn't the most handsome man in the room, but he had something. A stillness. A way of standing that suggested he was exactly where he intended to be and nowhere else. He was 31. He wore a suit that fit him the way good suits fit, which is to say it looked like it was part of him. He asked me to dance. Not my sister, who was prettier. Me. We danced to something slow, I don't remember what. He didn't talk much. He asked where I worked. I told him I was a secretary at a law firm in Manhattan. He asked if I liked it. I said it was fine. He said fine wasn't good enough for someone like me. I asked what he meant by someone like me. He said someone smart. Someone observant. Someone who knew how to be quiet. At the time I thought it was a compliment. Later I understood it was an assessment. He was deciding if I could be trusted. If I understood the value of discretion. If I knew how to exist in a room without taking up space that wasn't offered. We dated for 8 months. He took me to nice restaurants, always in Brooklyn, never Manhattan. He picked me up and dropped me off and never came inside my parents' apartment. He met my father twice, shook his hand both times, called him sir. My father, who drove a bus for 30 years and never trusted anyone who wore a suit that nice, told me Michael was trouble. I asked what kind of trouble. He said the kind that looks respectable. I didn't listen. You never do at 22. You think you're special. You think your situation is different. You think love is enough to insulate you from consequences. Michael proposed to me in his car, parked outside my building. No restaurant. No ring at first. Just a question. He said he wanted to marry me, but I needed to understand something first. He said the life he lived required certain things. Loyalty. Silence. The ability to not ask questions about things that didn't concern me. He said if I couldn't do that, he'd understand, but we'd be done. He said it plainly. Not meanly. Just as fact. I said yes. 3 weeks later he gave me a ring. We were married 4 months after that, in the same hall where we met, with 300 people I didn't know. That was 1968. I was 23 years old. I didn't know what I was saying yes to. I knew Michael worked in construction. That's what everyone said. Construction. He had an office in Sheepshead Bay with his name on the door and 2 secretaries and filing cabinets full of permits and contracts. But the office was too quiet. The phone didn't ring enough. The secretaries didn't type. They answered the phone and said he wasn't available and took messages he never seemed to return. I understood, in the way you understand things you're not supposed to acknowledge, that the office was a stage. That the real work happened elsewhere. In restaurants. In social clubs. In rooms I wasn't invited into. Michael kept me separate from that part of his life for the first 2 years. I was his wife. I stayed home. I learned to cook the way his mother cooked. I learned to keep the apartment perfect, not comfortable, perfect. I learned to be ready when he came home at midnight or 3 in the morning or not at all. I learned not to ask where he'd been. He wasn't cruel. He didn't hit me. He didn't yell. He was almost gentle in the way he trained me, like you'd train a dog, with consistency and patience and the understanding that certain behaviors would be rewarded and others would result in a silence that was worse than anger. The reward for good behavior was inclusion. Slowly. Carefully. He started taking me to dinners. Not dates. Business dinners disguised as social events. Restaurants where the owner would come over and shake Michael's hand and usher us to a table in the back, always the back, where you could see the door. Other couples would be there. Men Michael worked with. Their wives. We'd eat and talk about nothing. The weather. Vacations. Somebody's sister's wedding. The women would talk about furniture and recipes and where to get the best price on curtains. The men would talk around things. About a problem that got solved. About someone who wasn't around anymore. About how business was good, or business was complicated, or business required patience. That I learned to listen to what wasn't being said. I learned that when men excused themselves to make a phone call, they weren't making a phone call. When someone said they had to step outside for air, they weren't getting air. When a name came up and then didn't come up again, that name had become a problem that had been addressed. I learned the language of implication. The grammar of silence. And I learned that the wives knew everything and nothing. We knew the shape of it. The danger of it. The fact that our lives depended on our husband's ability to navigate a world where mistakes were permanent. But we didn't know details. Details were for men. Our job was to be beautiful, quiet, loyal, and ready to pretend that none of it was happening. I was good at my job. Better than I wanted to be. I made friends with the other wives. Maria, who was married to Vincent Castellano. Teresa, married to a man named Frank DeLuca who ran a waste management company that actually managed waste but also managed other things. Donna, whose husband I never fully understood but who always had money and always looked tired. We'd have lunch. We'd go shopping. We'd talk about our husbands in the way you talk about weather systems, as forces beyond our control that we'd learned to predict. Maria was the one who told me the truth, or as much truth as could be told. We were having coffee in her kitchen, and her youngest daughter was at school, and she looked at me with this expression that was exhausted and kind. And she said, "You know what they do, right?" I said I knew Michael worked in construction. She laughed. Not meanly. Just tired. She said, "Catherine, they all work in construction. They all have legitimate businesses. But that's not what they do. You know that." I did know that. But hearing it said out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. She said, "Vincent's been doing this since he was 16. Started running numbers for his uncle. It lets them keep us separate. Now he's involved in things I don't ask about. Safe. And I don't ask because the moment I ask, I become a liability." She looked at me like I'd asked if water was wet. She said, "Every single day. But fear is part of the deal. You marry into this, you marry the fear too. You just learn to live with it. You learn to sleep next to it. You learn to smile at dinners and act like everything's fine because everything has to be fine. Because the moment you crack, the moment you show you can't handle it, you become a problem. And problems get solved." That conversation changed something. It made the fear conscious. Before, it had been ambient, like humidity. After, it had shape. It had teeth. I started noticing things I'd been trained not to notice. The way Michael would come home and shower immediately, even if he'd showered that morning. The way certain phone calls would make his face go blank. The way he'd tell me we were going out, last minute, no explanation, and we'd drive to New Jersey or Westchester and have dinner with people I'd never met and would never see again, and the whole night would feel like a performance for an audience I couldn't see. I started noticing the other men. Not just Michael's friends, but the structure around them. The younger guys who did the actual work. The drivers. The guys who stood outside restaurants smoking and watching. The guys who weren't quite bodyguards but also weren't quite anything else. I started noticing how decisions got made. Not in loud arguments. In glances. In the way a conversation would shift after someone said something, and then everyone understood something had been decided, but no one had actually said what. I started understanding that this world ran on implication and interpretation. That explicitness was dangerous. That saying things out loud created evidence, and evidence created risk. So everything was coded. Everything was indirect. And if you couldn't understand the code, you didn't belong. By 1972, I'd been married 4 years. Michael's business had grown. We moved from a 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn to a house in Long Island. Not a mansion. A house. 3 bedrooms. A lawn. A driveway. The kind of house that said successful but not suspicious. The kind of house a construction company owner might have. Our neighbors were doctors, accountants, a guy who owned car dealerships. Normal people with normal lives who had no idea what Michael did. Or maybe they did and they decided not to know, which is its own kind of knowledge. I'd stopped working when we got married. Michael didn't want me to work. He wanted me available. He wanted me at home when he called. He wanted me ready to host dinners with 2 hours' notice. He wanted my entire life to revolve around his needs, his schedule, his world. And I let it happen. Not because I was weak. Because the alternative was worse. The alternative was being cut off. From money. From protection. From the only life I knew how to live anymore. I'd become dependent. Financially. Socially. Psychologically. I'd built my identity around being Michael's wife, and without that identity, I didn't know who I was. So I stayed. I smiled. I hosted dinners. I became friends with women who were just like me, who'd made the same choices, who carried the same fear. And I watched as the world we lived in got smaller and more dangerous. Because by the mid-70s, things were changing. The old rules were breaking down. The men who'd run things for decades were dying or going to prison. Younger men were moving up. And they were hungrier, more violent, less patient. The code that had kept things relatively stable, that had kept civilian casualties low, that had maintained some version of order, was fraying. Michael felt it. I could see it in the way he moved through the world. More careful. More paranoid. He started carrying a gun. Not always, but sometimes. I'd find it when I was putting away laundry. In his jacket pocket. In the glove compartment. He never mentioned it. I never asked. We had a new rule in our marriage. A silent one. We pretended nothing was wrong. We pretended everything was fine. We pretended the fear that filled our house like carbon monoxide wasn't there. And we got very good at pretending. That's the thing about living with danger. You adapt. Your nervous system recalibrates. What would have been intolerable becomes normal. You learn to sleep through sounds that should wake you. You learn to ignore implications that should terrify you. You learn to live in a state of constant low-grade panic that feels like nothing because it's always there. I think that's what they mean by complicity. Not that you participate. But that you stop resisting. You stop questioning. You accept the unacceptable because accepting it is easier than confronting it. And confronting it means losing everything. Vincent Castellano was Michael's closest friend. They'd grown up 3 blocks apart. They'd started working together when they were teenagers. By the time I knew them, they were partners. Not in any official sense. But in the way that mattered. They trusted each other. Which in that world meant everything. Vincent was different than Michael. Louder. Warmer. He'd tell jokes at dinners. He'd ask about my day and actually listen. He had 3 daughters he talked about constantly. He'd show me pictures of their dance recitals, their report cards, their birthdays. He loved them in that uncomplicated way some men love their daughters, like they were proof he was capable of something good. Maria, his wife, was my closest friend. We talked almost every day. About nothing and everything. About the strange, specific loneliness of being married to men who lived double lives. About the fear that never left. About the version of ourselves we'd buried to survive. We never talked about leaving. Leaving wasn't an option. You didn't leave. You didn't divorce. You didn't go to the police. You stayed. You kept your mouth shut. You protected your husband, and in return, he protected you. That was the deal. In the spring of 1976, something changed. I didn't know what. Michael didn't tell me. But I felt it. In the way he stopped sleeping. In the way he'd stare at nothing during dinner. In the way he started telling me not to go certain places, not to answer the phone unless I knew who it was. Not to talk to anyone about anything. One night he came home at 2 in the morning and sat in the living room in the dark. I came downstairs and found him there, still in his coat, just sitting. I asked if he was okay. He said, "Don't ever trust anyone completely, Catherine. Not even me." I didn't understand what he meant. I asked him to explain. He said, "Just remember I said that." 2 weeks later, Vincent was dead. The story was that it was a robbery. Someone had broken into the social club where Vincent spent most evenings. They'd shot him twice in the head and taken nothing. The police investigated. They found nothing. The funeral was enormous. Hundreds of people. Maria stood at the front in black. Her daughters beside her, and she didn't cry. She stood there like a statue, like she'd turned to stone to survive it. I stood next to her at the burial. I held her hand. It was cold. After everyone left, she turned to me and said, "It wasn't a robbery." I said I knew. She said, "Michael knows who did it." I didn't say anything. She said, "He was there, wasn't he?" That night. He was there. I wanted to lie. I wanted to protect Michael. I wanted to protect myself. But I couldn't lie to Maria. Not after everything. So I said, "I don't know." She looked at me with this expression I'll never forget. Not angry. Not even hurt. Just hollow. She said, "Yes, you do." She walked away. We never spoke again. That's when I understood. Michael hadn't pulled the trigger. But he'd known. He'd either known it was going to happen or he'd known immediately after. And he'd said nothing. He'd protected whoever did it. He'd chosen a side, and it wasn't Vincent's. I don't know why. I never asked. Asking would have made me a liability. Asking would have meant I couldn't pretend anymore. And pretending was the only thing keeping me alive. But I knew. I knew because of the way Michael looked at me after the funeral. I knew because of the way certain people stopped coming around. I knew because 3 men who used to have dinner with us regularly were dead within 6 months. One in a car accident that wasn't an accident. One who disappeared and was never found. One who was shot outside his house in front of his wife. The world was eating itself. And we were all just trying not to be next. I started having nightmares. Not about violence. About silence. I'd dream I was in a room full of people and I'd try to speak and nothing would come out. I'd try to scream and no sound would happen. I'd wake up gasping and Michael would be beside me, awake, staring at the ceiling. We stopped having sex. We stopped talking beyond the logistics of daily life. We became roommates in a house
Getting
full
on a
of dread.
bus.
I
Going
thought about
somewhere
leaving.
Michael
couldn't find me. I'd lie awake and
But I
plan
knew
it was a fantasy. I'd imagine packing
There was
a bag.
nowhere
he couldn't find me. And even if there was, leaving would make me a risk. People who left talked. And people who talked disappeared. So I stayed. I became quieter. Smaller. I stopped seeing friends. I stopped going out unless Michael told me to. I made myself invisible because invisibility felt like safety. By 1978, Michael was different. The man I'd married was gone. What was left was harder. Colder. He drank more. He slept less. He'd come home with blood on his shirt and tell me it was nothing, and I'd wash the shirt and not ask questions because questions were dangerous and I'd become very good at being safe. We were at a restaurant one night. One of the places we always went. Back table. Michael and 2 other men. Their wives. We were eating and talking about nothing, and one of the men, a guy named Tony who I'd met a dozen times, said something about a deal that had gone wrong. Michael's face didn't change. But the air changed. The temperature dropped. Michael said, very quietly, "We don't talk about that here." Tony laughed it off. Said he was just making conversation. Michael said, "We don't talk about that here," again, and this time it wasn't a suggestion. Tony nodded. The dinner continued. But everyone knew. Tony had made a mistake. Not a big one. But mistakes accumulated. 2 months later. Tony was arrested. Federal charges. Racketeering. They said he'd been cooperating with the FBI. They said he'd been wearing a wire. I don't know if it was true. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that people believed it. And belief was enough. Tony pleaded guilty. He went to prison for 15 years. His wife divorced him. She moved to Florida with their kids. And Tony, who'd been at our house for Christmas dinner, who'd held my coat, who'd told jokes and seemed harmless, became a cautionary tale. That's how fast you could fall. One wrong word. One bad decision. One moment of weakness. And everything you'd built, everyone you knew, would cut you loose. Would erase you. Would act like you'd never existed. I thought about that a lot. About how disposable we all were. How the loyalty everyone talked about was conditional. How the family they claimed to be wasn't a family at all. It was a business. And in business, people are assets until they're liabilities. And liabilities get liquidated. Michael started keeping me even more separate. He stopped taking me to dinners. He stopped telling me when he'd be home. He'd leave for days sometimes. He'd call once to tell me he was alive, and that was it. I'd stay in the house. I'd clean. I'd cook meals no one ate. I'd watch television and not absorb a single thing. I'd exist in this strange liminal state between wife and widow, never knowing which one I'd become. I started drinking. Not a lot. Just enough to take the edge off the fear. A glass of wine with lunch. 2 before bed. It helped me sleep. It helped me stop thinking. It helped me survive. One afternoon the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. We'd been getting strange calls. Hang-ups. Calls where someone would breathe and then disconnect. Michael said to stop answering unless I knew who it was. But this time I answered. It was a man's voice I didn't recognize. He said, "Is this Catherine?" I said yes. He said, "You should leave him." I said, "Excuse me." He said, "Your husband. You should leave him. You seem like a nice person. You don't deserve what's coming." Then he hung up. I stood there holding the phone. My hands were shaking. I didn't tell Michael. I don't know why. Maybe because I was afraid he'd think I'd done something to provoke it. Maybe because I was afraid he'd tell me it was nothing and I'd have to pretend to believe him. Or maybe because part of me wanted to believe the man on the phone. Wanted to believe there was still time to leave. That I still had a choice. But I didn't leave. I unplugged the phone. I made dinner. When Michael came home I acted like nothing had happened. Because nothing had happened. A phone call from a stranger was nothing compared to everything else. That's how warped my sense of normal had become. Threats were background noise. Fear was baseline. The only thing that could shock me anymore was safety, and safety didn't exist. In the fall of 1979, Michael told me we were going to a wedding. A cousin of someone he worked with. Big wedding. Brooklyn. He said I should wear something nice. He said it was important that we looked good. That we seemed happy. I wore a blue dress. I did my makeup carefully. I smiled. We went to the wedding. It was like every other wedding I'd been to in that world. Too many people. Too much food. Men in suits standing in clusters, talking in low voices. Women in expensive dresses, pretending not to notice. We sat at a table with people I'd met before but couldn't really remember. We ate. We danced once. Michael held me like he was holding a piece of furniture. Functional. Disconnected. During dinner, a man came over to our table. I didn't know him. He was young. Maybe late 20s. He leaned down and said something to Michael I couldn't hear. Michael nodded. He stood up. He looked at me and said, "I'll be back." He wasn't. I sat there for 2 hours. I made small talk with the other wives. I drank champagne I didn't taste. I waited. Finally, one of the men at our table, someone Michael worked with, came over and said Michael had to leave. He'd make sure I got home. I asked if everything was okay. He said everything was fine. I knew it wasn't. The man drove me home. We didn't talk. He walked me to the door. He waited until I was inside. Then he left. Michael didn't come home that night. Or the next. On the third day, he called. He said he was fine. He said not to worry. He said he'd be home soon. He sounded tired. Not scared. Just tired. Like he'd been awake for 72 hours. Like he'd seen things he couldn't unsee. He came home a week later. He looked older. Thinner. He came in, took off his coat, and sat down at the kitchen table. I made him coffee. He drank it. He stared at the wall. Finally, I said, "What happened?" He said, "Nothing you need to know about." I said, "Michael, please. I'm your wife." He looked at me. Really looked at me. For the first time in years. He said, "That's exactly why you don't need to know." That was the closest we ever came to honesty. To acknowledging what our marriage actually was. A transaction. He kept me safe from knowledge. I kept him safe from questions. We were protecting each other by staying separate. By maintaining the lie that we were a normal couple living a normal life. But we weren't. We were two people trapped in a system that required our silence to function. And our silence was killing us. By 1980, I'd stopped recognizing myself. I'd look in the mirror and see a woman I didn't know. Someone who smiled on command. Who dressed well and said nothing. Who'd traded her entire self for safety that wasn't even real. I was 35 years old. I had no children. Michael and I had stopped trying years ago. I had no job. No purpose beyond being his wife. No identity beyond my proximity to him. I had money. A nice house. Nice clothes. Nice things. And I was utterly empty. I thought about dying. Not suicide exactly. Just not being alive anymore. Just the absence of this. The absence of fear and pretending and the exhausting performance of normalcy. But I didn't die. I just kept going. Because that's what you do. You survive. Even when survival feels like its own kind of death. The night I almost walked into that room was in April 1981. Michael had told me to meet him at the club. He didn't usually ask me to come there. The club was men's space. But he'd said to meet him at 9. He'd said we were going to dinner after with some people. I got there at 9 exactly. I walked in. The front room was empty except for one guy I recognized, sitting at a table, reading a newspaper. He looked up when I came in. He looked surprised to see me. He said, "Michael's in the back." I said thank you. I walked through the front room toward the back. There was a hallway. At the end of the hallway was a door. I walked down the hallway. I reached for the doorknob. And I heard it. That sound. Not quite a voice. Not quite silence. Something in between. Something wrong. I stopped. My hand on the doorknob. And I listened. I heard breathing. Heavy breathing. Then a chair scraping. Then footsteps. Coming toward the door. I took my hand off the doorknob. I walked backward. Slowly. In heels. On marble. I made it to the front room. The guy with the newspaper didn't look up. I walked outside. I got in my car. I sat there. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what I'd almost walked into. But I knew it was bad. At midnight, Michael came home. He looked at me. He said, "Where were you?" I said, "I came to the club." "You weren't there." So I left. He studied my face. Looking for lies. Looking for knowledge. I kept my face blank. Empty. He said, "Okay." He went upstairs. I sat there until morning. The next day I found out Vincent was dead. Shot twice in the head in the back room of the club. The same room I'd almost walked into. The police came to our house. They asked Michael where he was that night. He said he was at the club until 8, then he went home. They asked if anyone could verify that. He said his wife could. They looked at me. I said yes. He came home at 8. They wrote it down. They left. Michael and I never talked about it. Not that night. Not ever. But we both knew. We both knew I'd lied. We both knew why. We both knew that lying made me complicit. Made me part of it. Made me something I'd never wanted to be. After that, things got worse. More people died. More people went to prison. The FBI was everywhere. Wiretaps. Surveillance. Informants. The world was collapsing. And everyone knew it. Michael started talking about getting out. Not out of the life. You didn't get out of the life. But out of New York. He talked about Florida. About starting over. About being careful. But it was too late for careful. Careful was years ago. Now was just damage control. In 1983, Michael was indicted. Federal racketeering charges. They had recordings. They had witnesses. They had evidence. His lawyer said he was looking at 20 years. Michael took a plea. 12 years. He went to prison in the spring of 1984. I was 39 years old. I visited him once a month for the first year. Then every other month. Then I stopped going. Not because I stopped loving him. Because I'd never really loved him. I'd loved the idea of him. The protection. The stability. The life I thought we were building. But that life had been a lie. And I'd spent 15 years maintaining the lie. And I was tired. I filed for divorce in 1986. Michael didn't contest it. He signed the papers from prison. He called me once after. He said he understood. He said he hoped I'd be okay. He said he was sorry. Not for what he'd done. But for what he'd made me complicit in. For what he'd turned me into. I said I was sorry too. We never spoke again. He got out in 1994. I heard he moved to Florida. I heard he got remarried. I heard he died in 2003. Heart attack. I didn't go to the funeral. I moved to California after the divorce. I changed my name. I got a job as a secretary again. I rebuilt a life that was small and quiet and mine. I made friends who knew nothing about who I'd been. I dated men who thought my past was boring. I learned how to be a person again. But I never forgot. You don't forget. You carry it. The weight of the silence. The complicity. The fear. The things you saw and didn't see. The things you knew and didn't know. The version of yourself you abandoned to survive. I'm 70 years old now. I live alone. I have a small apartment with a view of the ocean. I have a garden. I have books. I have a life that is unremarkable and precious. And sometimes I think about that night. About the door I didn't open. About the 30 seconds that saved my life. About all the choices I made that led me to that hallway. About the woman I was who would have opened that door without hesitation because she trusted her husband completely. About the woman I became who knew better. I don't know if I did the right thing. Staying as long as I did. Lying for him. Becoming part of the machine. I tell myself I was surviving. That I did what I had to do. But I know that's not entirely true. I had choices. They were bad choices. Dangerous choices. But they were choices. I chose to stay. I chose to be quiet. I chose to look the other way. And those choices made me complicit in things I'll never be able to make right. People ask me sometimes what it was like. Being married to a man like that. Being part of that world. They want stories. They want drama. They want the movie version. But the truth is quieter than that. It's not gunfights and betrayals and dramatic confrontations. It's silence. It's fear you learn to live with. It's the slow erosion of yourself until you can't remember who you were before. It's the weight of knowledge you can't speak. It's the isolation of being surrounded by people who are all performing the same lie. It's the exhaustion of pretending. It's the guilt of surviving when others didn't. That's what it was like. And I wouldn't wish it on anyone. Maria died in 1998. Cancer. I found out through someone who knew someone. I wanted to go to the funeral. But I didn't. Because I didn't know if she'd ever forgiven me. For lying. For protecting Michael. For choosing my survival over her knowing the truth about her husband's death. I carry that too. The people I failed. The truth I didn't tell. The moments I chose safety over honesty. I carry all of it. And some days it's heavy. And some days it's just there. Part of me. Like a scar you stop noticing until you catch it in the mirror and remember how you got it. I'm telling this now because everyone's dead. Because enough time has passed that the fear feels distant. Because I'm old enough that consequences don't scare me the way they used to. And because I think there are other women out there who know what this feels like. Who are living in the silence right now. Who are making the same choices I made. Who are eroding themselves to survive. And I want them to know that survival is possible. That you can leave. That you can rebuild. That the fear doesn't last forever. But I also want them to know the cost. That leaving means losing everything. That rebuilding means starting from nothing. That the fear might fade but the guilt doesn't. That you'll carry it forever. That there's no version of this story where you get out clean. I don't have advice. I don't have wisdom. I just have my story. And my story is this: I was married to a man who lived in a world built on violence and silence. I didn't participate in the violence. But I maintained the silence. And the silence made me complicit. I survived. But survival isn't the same as innocence. And I'm not innocent. I'm just old. And tired. And finally able to speak. Even if speaking changes nothing. Even if no one hears it. Even if it's too late. It's still true. And truth, Even delayed, even incomplete, even compromised by time and fear and guilt, is still worth telling. So that's what I'm doing. I'm telling the truth. As much of it as I know. As much of it as I can bear to speak. The rest I'll carry with me. The rest is mine. The silence I kept. The door I didn't open. The 30 seconds that saved my life and damned my soul. That's the story. That's what it was really like. Not the movie. Not the myth. Just the weight. The fear. The slow disappearance of yourself. And the knowledge that you let it happen. That you chose it. That you survived it. And that survival, in the end, is all you get.